Hi, everyone. Welcome to the June 11th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona, and I'll be joined in just a second by my co-host, Craig Milkowski. This week on the podcast, we're going to wrap up the Triple Crown season. We'll discuss the recently completed Belmont Stakes from last Saturday at Belmont Park. We'll also go into all of the other awesome stakes action that took place last Saturday, as well as during the other 3 days of the Belmont Stakes Racing Festival last weekend. We'll touch upon how the track was playing, the implications for some of these races as they pertain to stakes later in the year, and just everything else that's going on in the racing world. So I'll welcome in my co-host, Craig Milkowski. Craig, how was your Belmont Stakes day?
It was a very good day. Just tons of exciting racing. I mean, it almost felt like a Breeders' Cup day to me. There were so many great horses that we saw. Most of them delivered with really top performances, and a few even surprised us. So just a blast for me as a fan and as a bettor. Great betting races, too.
Yeah, it was just a really satisfying day of racing because a lot of the top horses that were expected to show up with big performances, they did so, and some of them even exceeded expectations. The Belmont Stakes, it was the kind of race that I think it played out to be on paper. I mean, it was a wide open field going in, and I think it just kind of captures the current state of this three-year-old division where there's no clear leader at the moment. And let's talk about the Belmont Stakes, the main event, a little bit. It was, of course, won by Sir Winston, who got just an awesome ride from Joel Rosario. He just made every right move, put his horse in the right spots at every point in the race, really. And that made the difference for him over the second place finisher Tacitus. I thought both of these horses ran really well.
They certainly did. I think they were clearly the two best. I would probably side that Tacitus might have been the best horse. Just had some bad luck. I don't want to knock Joel. I don't want to knock Jose Ortiz too much for the ride because he was kind of up against it with the bad post, but I don't think it was his best effort. I don't think he found a very good position at any point in the race, and obviously lost a ton of ground. And, I'll just leave it at that. The rides made the difference.
Yeah, we're going to get into the discussion of how the track was playing in a little bit. We'll touch upon it just briefly by saying that you did want to be on the rail. I think generally you wanted to be saving as much ground as possible on the dirt at Belmont on Saturday. And we'll talk about the other days of the week as well. But I think that was true for maybe multiple days. And Sir Winston was just right along the rail for almost his entire trip. As soon as they broke out of the gate, Joel Rosario just made that left-hand turn, put Sir Winston on the inside. He squeezed through that tight opening around the far turn inside of Everfast, and that really put him in position to earn the victory. It was kind of funny to me watching the Belmont Stakes on replay later. It reminded me so much of the ride that Joel Rosario gave Governor Malibu in the Belmont Stakes 3 years ago. And if you remember that race, he didn't get off the rail with enough time coming to the top of the stretch, and he sort of got pinned down in there. And he arguably might have won that race if he'd gotten out in time, but he was just steadied multiple times in upper stretch that day. And you could see coming to the top of the stretch this day, I wonder if he had that ride in the back of his mind, because he seemed really intent on getting Sir Winston off the rail as soon as possible as that hole opened up just outside him and he swung out. I don't think there was any interference that affected the result, so I have no problem with the fact that there was no inquiry into him swinging out at that point in the race. But he just did it all perfectly. I agree with you about Tacitus. That kind of trip going four wide around both turns, I know it's Belmont Park and ground loss is not quite as important there as it is at other tracks, but that's still not a great trip under any circumstances, even on a fair racetrack. So I do think you can make a strong argument that Tacitus was probably best in this race, but that's just sometimes how the trips play out, and Tacitus will have many opportunities later in the year to prove that maybe he is the best three-year-old out there.
He will, and I haven't mentioned yet, Sir Winston got a 119 TimeformUS speed figure for the race, Tacitus a 118, and it just kind of lends credence to what you were saying. I think this group of three-year-olds, they're pretty unspectacular, but they're also pretty evenly matched. I've seen a lot of people just conceding the division lead to Maximum Security, just based on his finishing first in the Derby. But even that one, I would argue, had a lot to do with the trip. He got away with some really slow interior fractions. And I don't think he's any standout in this crop either. I think if these horses keep racing each other, we're going to see a lot of flip-flopping of positions and a bunch of different horses taking turns beating each other.
I totally agree with that. I don't think Maximum Security has any kind of edge on these horses, because I agree with your assessment of the Derby about how it favored his running style that day and just the kind of trip he got. And also, he only's done it that one time, and you can say that about most of these horses. I mean, at least the feather in Tacitus's cap is that he's showed up twice in one of these big races, both in the Kentucky Derby and in the Belmont Stakes, whereas a lot of others are just kind of one-hit wonders at this point. You could even probably say that about War of Will, who might have run a big race in the Derby, but he ran his big race in the Preakness. For whatever reason, War of Will just didn't show up here. You could blame the way the track was playing, but I think it was more than that because Tacitus was wide too, and War of Will just never seemed to really have that late punch in the stretch. You could see that he was beaten at the quarter pole, so maybe the Triple Crown grind just took its toll on him. As for some of the others in this race, I didn't think many of the other horses did a whole lot of running, although it's not like Sir Winston won this race by a gargantuan margin or Tacitus was second by a lot. They were really bunched at the finish. Even horses like Tax and Spinoff only lost this race by about 2.5 or 3 lengths. I think their performances do kind of lend some, well, I'll get into it a little bit later, but I don't think the track bias situation was quite as pronounced as some are saying, because horses like Tax and Spinoff were 2 to 3 wide throughout, and they ran perfectly fine in this Belmont Stakes. I don't think they were badly compromised. Master Fencer did his usual act, just coming on too late, but all of these horses just weren't quite as good as the top 2.
Yeah, I was going to say my one real disappointment here was Master Fencer. Not that I thought he was a strong win contender, but I thought he'd run a little better with the added distance, but he virtually ran the same race he did in the Derby while not quite finishing as fast, obviously. So he was the only one that really disappointed me in the field. War of Will, as you mentioned, I took note, when he didn't work out or do much of anything after the Preakness. To me, that wasn't a very good sign. I mean, they still ran him, and I'm sure the trainer thought he would be fine, but to not even work the horse a little bit, I thought it was bad, and he ran to that.
Yeah, just to kind of wrap up Sir Winston for a second, he's the kind of horse that really seems to be improving right now, and I think Mark Casse touched upon that in the press conference after the race. This division is really wide open, and if a horse takes another step forward at this point, they could easily be the division leader. I mean, even a horse like Game Winner, if he gets back in the summer, he's a kind of horse that could take a step forward as a 3-year-old and be the leader of this division. But I think Sir Winston's that horse too, because a lot of these horses have just kind of hit their plateau for the Triple Crown season, and we have to see if they can make that extra push to improve later in the season, and we really don't know. But the Travers is shaping up to be a great race because I assume all of these horses will be pointing for that race. And I always like these Triple Crown seasons that have 3 different winners of the races, because it usually does make for a really good, exciting second half of the year and an awesome Travers field.
Yeah, it does. And we even have horses like Global Campaign, who beat Sir Winston in the Peter Pan last time out, who didn't participate in the Triple Crown due to his injury that he had. So he's another one, and I'm sure there's a few others out there that I'm forgetting. But definitely going to be some deep competitive races, I would think, coming up.
Yeah, for sure. We'll move on to the other stakes races on the Belmont Park undercard on Saturday, and then we'll move on to the other days after that. Let's start with the race that really had second billing to the Belmont Stakes, the Met Mile, won by Mitole. And before we really do a deep dive into this race, I do want to just touch upon the track bias situation, because I think it's going to color a lot of our discussions around the dirt races at Belmont Park on Saturday. What did you make of the talk of there being a strong rail bias on Saturday at Belmont, or a strong speed bias?
I thought it was more a rail bias on Saturday. I don't think there's any doubt the rail was the preferred path. Horses like Jovia, Geltrin, who ran later on the card, who both were able to finish third at huge odds after spending a bulk of the time on the rail. And just the visual, it just looked like horses got a little extra energy when they were on the rail. Now, granted, usually speed horses are going to be the ones on the rail, but in this case, horses coming from off of it. We're going to talk about McKinsey. He spent a whole bunch of time on the rail and was just flying late. So I definitely think there was a rail bias on Saturday and even Friday as well. I think it was more of the same. We have Friday coded in red as being a strong speed bias. But even in that case, I think it was more indicative that the rail was the place to be than it was so much just speed.
Yeah, I've got a slightly different take on it. I do think that the rail was a good place to be. Watching a lot of the races back, I watched a lot of the head-on replays, just trying to see which horses really helped by the situation. And I think if you watch closely, it wasn't just the rail that was the good place to be. I think it really was not detrimental to be in the 2-path either, because throughout both especially Saturday, a bunch of horses that raced just one path off the rail, just like Mitole did in the Met Mile, as horses did in the Belmont Stakes, as horses did in the Brooklyn, even in the Woody Stevens. Horses that were racing one path off the rail did not seem to be compromised severely, definitely, maybe not compromised at all. And if you actually look at the way that the track is visually appears on the head-on, there's almost this this line in the dirt, maybe due to like the edge of a tractor or whatever they comb the track with, that was right outside the two path. And it seemed like horses that were racing right inside of that line had no issue. And horses that were racing wider than that, per se, in the three path or the four path, they seem to be a little bit compromised. So I don't want to go overboard with saying that you had to be right on the rail to have success on Saturday, because I don't think that was the case. And just moving on to the Met Mile to discuss Mitole, he ran great because of the pace situation. I know it's not color-coded as red fractions in our Timeform US PPs, but I would assume it's borderline, because the early pace was pretty honest. And Mitole he just has such great natural speed, and you could tell coming around the far turn, he was setting those fast fractions, but just doing it so easily, even had his ears pricked forward. He's just a horse that lays down those fractions with such ease. And coming to the top of the stretch, he kicked for home. I mean, I don't want to diminish his performance in any way by saying that McKenzie had trouble and might have won the race. And I do believe McKenzie would have won this race with a clear trip. I don't think that's really up for debate. Maybe you would say that Mitole was the better horse, and I think that's a fair argument to make because of the pace situation. But McKenzie was just in a world of trouble in the stretch drive, and he had so much run, and he even regathered himself and was coming fastest of all across the finish line after getting stopped twice. Usually horses aren't able to regain their momentum at that point in the race. So I think these two were very close. This is the one race, though, that left me a little bit unsatisfied, because it's probably the only time we're ever going to get to see these two horses meet up, McKenzie and Mitole, because they really are going to be on separate paths after this. And it's just a little disappointing we didn't get a definitive answer as to who's better over the flat mile.
Yeah, and I think you make a great point there. I made a tweet about people jumping on saying McKenzie was the best horse in the race, and I don't necessarily agree with that as you do. But it's a different discussion if he would have won the race. I certainly think with a clear trip that he would have won the race. But, had he won the race and got up and won by a half length or a length, a lot of people would be looking back and saying, well, given the pace and the pressure that Mitole faced, he was the best horse. So that was the only point I was really making. Sometimes things don't come across on Twitter, or people misread your intention. And you know what I was saying, it both ran phenomenal races, I think. Mitole got a 132 on our figures, McKenzie a 130. Even Thunder Snow, who I think was at a bit distant, shorter distance of what he really wants to go, ran a nice 130. And Promises Fulfilled got a 127 after breaking poorly and kind of get stuck in that three path you were talking about, pressing the fast pace. So I thought the top four ran well. Maybe with a clean trip, like you said, I think there's no doubt he wins. But he also had some things going his way, given the pace set up and the fact that he was able to save ground a lot of the way. And when you try to come from behind and you try to save a lot of ground, that's often what can happen, unlike what we saw in the Belmont.
I totally agree with that. I mean, it wasn't Mike Smith's best ride. I'm sure it's a ride that he'd want to take back and do over again. But that's just the way things work out sometimes when you're trying to come from the back of the pack. I do want to briefly touch upon Promises Fulfilled just to kind of wrap up the rail bias discussion, because having established that I think that the one and the two path were okay on Saturday at Belmont Park, I don't think that being wider than that was quite as detrimental as a lot of people are making it out to be. It wasn't the kind of day where you were going to get eased if you were outside of the two path. I mean, we've seen rail biases at different NYRA tracks, especially at Aqueduct during the winter, where if your horse is in the three path coming around the far turn, he's going to lose by 20 lengths. It wasn't that kind of day. I mean, it was not nearly that detrimental to be wide on Saturday at Belmont Park. And I think Promises Fulfilled and some other horses that we'll touch upon later really exemplifies that, because Promises Fulfilled was in the three path for the entire race, was never closer to the rail than that. And he ran on pretty well to be fourth. I mean, are you really going to argue that Promises Fulfilled was so badly compromised that he would have won the race? I think that's a bit of a stretch. So I think horses like Promises Fulfilled and performances like that kind of they provide examples that maybe the rail bias cost horses 2 lengths, in the mile and a half races, maybe 3 to 4 lengths, but I don't think it was the sort of situation where the results would have been so wildly different if horses had been on the inside.
Yeah, I would agree with that. In Mike Maloney's book, I forget the name of the book. I don't know if you've read it or not, but he kind of categorizes biases. And I don't think this one would have been at the top of his list, where you had to be in the 1 or 2 pass to run well. And certainly some of the other races point that out. So, yeah, no question with what you're saying. I agree. I don't think it killed you to be out there. It just was a disadvantage.
Yeah, for sure. I would agree with that. And I think we saw that in the Ogden Phipps as well. Midnight Bisou, she put in one of her best performances, arguably the best performance of her career to win this race. A lot of people, me included, were billing it as a matchup with Come Dancing. I actually preferred Come Dancing in this race. I thought that she'd have a pace advantage, and I thought that she'd be able to ride that best part of the racetrack. All of that was really true, but Midnight Bisou just overcame her with that effective late kick that she has in the lane. And you could see coming to the quarter pole, this race was going to be over pretty quickly, because as soon as Mike Smith peeled Midnight Bisou out off the rail, she just shut the door on Come Dancing. And what a filly that she's turned into as a 4-year-old, Midnight Bisou. She's really shown how much you can take a step forward from your 3-year-old season to your 4-year-old season as a filly or mare. She's just a much better filly than she ever was last year.
Yeah, well, I mean, what a performance. I mean, she really blew me away. She went by Come Dancing like she was standing still virtually. And, that one had a little bit tough a start where she almost went down to her nose, but I don't think it really had any effect on the outcome. She still was able to set a pretty easy lead. She had a real slow pace figure at the first quarter mile, and she still held on for second to run well. But the 127 TimeformUS speed figure Midnight Bisou got is her career best. And, I think it matched what we saw with our eyes, matched what the number says. It was her best race by far so far in her career.
Yeah, and it is worth pointing out that she is another horse that may have been slightly helped by the rail bias. I'm not saying that she didn't run the best race that she ever has, because I think she did. But the margin of victory was maybe slightly exaggerated by the fact that she was on the rail for most of her trip. I know that Come Dancing was as well, so it's not like she was compromised. But the fact that Midnight Bisou was able to run such a high speed figure in this race might have something to do with the fact that she was on the best part of the racetrack. And just to kind of touch upon the point I was making with Promises Fulfilled in this Ogden Phipps, Mopetism was 3 to 4 wide throughout her trip in this race, and she almost caught Come Dancing for second. I mean, if you're going to argue that the rail bias was costing horses, 5, 6, 7 lengths, then you're trying to argue that Mopetism would have beat Midnight Bisou in this race. And I think you got to be careful of making those, of getting a little carried away with the hyperbole about how strong these rail biases are, because I don't think Mopetism was ever winning this race, even though she only lost by 5 lengths, despite going about 3 wide or on the turns. So Midnight Bisou, though, I don't want to take anything away from her performance. She's just the top filly in the country. Seemed like she was going to have a real challenge on her hands in this race, and she just kind of laughed it off. She is the undisputed division leader.
She is. I'm really curious if she can go further, but, the rail maybe plays some into that. But watching her on Saturday, it certainly didn't seem like she'd have any problem with another 16th of a mile. That's for sure.
No, it definitely didn't. Sticking with the fillies on the dirt, maybe the performance that most people were talking about at the end of Saturday, aside from the Belmont Stakes, was the Acorn, where Guarana had her coming out party. I mean, this filly was, I can't remember the last time I saw a 3-year-old filly that was quite this impressive over a round of ground. I know we saw Kofethi in the Miss Preakness a few weeks ago in that 6-furlong sprint race, but for a horse to go a mile, in the final time that she achieved, with the kind of kick that she showed after racing relatively close to a really fast pace. I mean, the early fractions of this Acorn were just insanely fast, and Guarana was only about 2.5 lengths off that pace. I mean, you could see coming to the top of the stretch, Serengeti Empress was trying really hard and she was kicking for home. But as soon as Jose Ortiz got Guarana off the rail, I mean, she just looked like a tank compared to Serengeti Empress, just in size and the powerful nature with which she was moving. This filly is a really serious racehorse.
She is. I mean, I would have to say this was probably the performance of the day. I mean, we just spent a good 5 minutes raving about the race Midnight Bisou ran, and I don't know which he run, probably 10 or 12 times by now. And here we get a 3-year-old filly run a 126, just 1 point below in her second career start. I mean, it's just an amazing performance. I sure the rail, I guess, helped her a little bit, but she's a horse that if she was in the 5 path all the way around, I don't think it mattered. She was still winning this race. She was just way above the rest, and it'll be interesting to see if she can handle 2 turns. But at this point, she's already run faster than the Colts have been running. So just an incredibly talented filly, and really hope we get to see more of her this year.
Yeah, to the people that were a little surprised by this performance, because she was impressive in her debut, but admittedly she was beating nothing that day at Keeneland, and it was a sloppy track. And I know it elicited some comparisons to Hidden Scroll, which I don't think were fair at all. But Guarana is a horse that has been training exceptionally well since that maiden victory. If you watch some of her workouts since that race, she had been making that older filly, Electric Forest, look like a claimer in workouts in the morning. I mean, she was just putting that filly away and was just working with so much ease coming into this race. Not surprised she went off the favorite. Not surprised she put down a career best performance. But I don't think anybody was anticipating this kind of dominant victory. And I'm just really excited to see where they go with her, because it's a perfectly valid pathway to take to cut her back to 7 furlongs in the test, because she's got so much natural speed. But it sounds like Chad Brown's a little more interested in stretching her out in distance in a race like the Coaching Club American Oaks. She certainly got the pedigree to do it, because she's by Ghost Sapper, who's a versatile sire, and she's got one of these Phipps pedigrees on the dam side. She's her second dam, I believe, is Pleasant Home, the winner of the Breeders' Cup Distaff a number of years ago. Same family as Country Hideaway, those great horses from the late 90s. So she's got pedigree to go longer distances. Just really excited to see how she develops from here.
You read my mind. I was going to ask you about the pedigree, but since you hit it, we'll skip that. And just want to briefly mention before we get onto the Woody Stevens, just how fast the pace was. I mean, the raw fractions obviously came up on the screen. I think we had a sub 22 and a sub 44 half mile, which is just insane for a race of this distance. And yet Serengeti Empress was able to hold on. Obviously, she was on the best part of the track, but I think it was a really good performance for her to run second. She got a 122 TimeformUS speed figure, which was easily the best of her career so far. For certainly nothing to hang her head about in defeat here.
Yeah, I want to give Serengeti Empress some love, because I've been hard on her. I just totally dismissed her in this race. I didn't even put her in my top 4 picks. I just thought she was going to have a really tough time of it in this Acorn, and she really exceeded my expectations. I didn't think that she had this kind of fight in her. She was on a contested pace. You said how fast those pace figures were, how fast those fractions were. And the fact that both of these fillies, Guarana and Serengeti Empress, earned speed figures in the 120s, that's faster than almost any of the Colts in the 3-year-old division have run, except for maybe War of Will. So these two are pretty nice, and they put forth exceptional performances on Saturday. I'm sure Tom Amos won't be looking to face Guarana again anytime soon, but Serengeti Empress is going to be pretty tough wherever she shows up from here.
She is, and the last note on her, I mean, it's not easy to show that kind of speed when you turn back from a race like the Oaks to a one-turn race like this, and she was gunned out of the rail and just showed just how fast a filly she really is. That's not something you see a lot of fillies be able to do like she did.
The one race on Saturday that really bucked the trend of inside horses having an advantage was the Woody Stevens, won by Hog Creek Hustle. Hog Creek Hustle was briefly on the inside at the very beginning of the race, but he was really about 4 to 5 wide for the majority of his trip, and he was able to win this race. But that was primarily due to the fact that it was just a complete pace meltdown ahead of him. And this race was totally dominated by closers, totally dominated by long shot closers to be exact. And that's something that we've just seen a lot of in the Woody Stevens. This race usually gets a lot of speed horses, and it's usually susceptible to a pace collapse.
Yeah, this was one that really made my Saturday. It's a race that TimeformUS Pace Projector predictably had identified as a race that was almost assured to have a fast pace. Hog Creek Hustle had much the best TimeformUS late pace rating. And he's a horse, despite how the track was playing, given the odds, I just took a big shot with. I wasn't smart enough to play the other closers with him. I just stuck to betting him to win in place in here. But big effort, had to sweat out the inquiry, but I think we did see some other good performances. Probably the most surprising thing for me in the race was that Strike Silver actually made the lead, and I thought he ran a big race as well. And actually on our speed figures, he got the highest at 118, which was 4 points higher than the winner Hog Creek Hustle got with a 114.
I think this race actually does show the kind of impact that the rail bias had. even though it was won by a horse that was outside, you saw that Strike Silver, who was setting that very fast pace and did the best of all the speed horses, he was just glued to the rail for almost his entire trip. And I think that really helped him in a race where almost all of the other main contenders were outside of that rail path. And in a situation where one horse is getting the right trip down inside and all of his other main contenders are outside, you'll see a horse like Strike Silver outrun his odds. It wasn't the kind of racetrack that was ever going to make Strike Silver a winner of this race because the rail bias wasn't quite that pronounced. But I do think it probably moved Strike Silver up about 3 or 4 lengths, and that allowed him to run by far the best speed figure of his career and get back on dirt and show that he's still a decent dirt sprinter because they had focused on turf with him recently. But he was aided by the racetrack, as was Wendell Fong to some extent. He was a little wide early, but I thought Jorge Vargas did a great job to drop him down to the rail in the stretch, and he really rode the rail from the quarter pole home and was able to get up inside of him to be 5th. But this race was just dominated by the closers. I had liked Baracho coming in. He got the right pace set up. I thought Jose Lezcano was trying to do the right thing, keeping him inside of horses for as much as possible. He really rode the rail for the entire run around the far turn. But when a pace is collapsing like this, you don't want to get caught on the rail. And he just had to wait a little bit longer than the jockeys on Nitrous and Hog Creek Hustle. And he ended up losing a bit of momentum and coming on again late. Maybe in a different circumstance, he would have won the race, but he would have done it with a totally different or with a very favorable trip. So I can't get too upset about that. Just a race that I don't know if it really has implications for races later in the year, like the Allen Jerkins, because it was kind of a unique situation. Just speaks to how wide open this 3-year-old sprint division really is.
Yeah, and the one note I want to make, and we mentioned it briefly with Mackenzie, but especially in a sprint race like this, when you do try to save ground on a track and come from behind, when the rail is good, the horses just don't tend to tire as much and drift and leave those spaces to get through. Sir Winston was able to do it in a race that's 1.5 miles because even when the inside is good, horses are going to tend to tire. But I think most of these horses had quite a bit left, even with the fast pace. So it just gets a little tougher to find those holes to get through.
That's a really good point about the trips, actually. And I think we saw why Hog Creek Hustle was able to win the race. He stayed outside of all of that trouble and was able to get the job done. And sometimes that's just the right place to be, even on a rail-biased racetrack. We'll move on to some of the turf races from Saturday at Belmont Park. And the most impressive of them was probably Bricks and Mortar's win in the Manhattan. He just seems to keep getting better. I know we've seen some great efforts out of him already this year. This was one of his more decisive victories because he's a horse that usually puts in a strong late run and just kind of desperately gets there at the wire. You could tell that this race was over a long way out. Irad Ortiz had him in the right spot at the quarter pole, and he just shut the door on this field. Bricks and Mortar's just in top form right now, and we'll see what Chad Brown does with him through the second half of the year, but he proved that he can at least get 1.25 miles.
No doubt. Now, I want to give a tip of the hat to Irad Ortiz, who I think gave a great ride in here because the only horse that could really run with him was Robert Bruce, and he basically kept that horse pinned in. So he got first run on him, got a jump while that one had to wait. And I'm not saying Robert Bruce would have beat him, but I think it would have been a lot closer at the finish. He essentially forced his brother to wait till he cleared and kind of follow him home to complete the exacta.
Yeah, somebody who bet Robert Bruce and would have had a really fantastic day on Saturday if Robert Bruce had won this race. I mean, I have no problems with that assessment. I don't think Robert Bruce was ever winning this race. He did keep him in a little bit. Irad Ortiz did, and he made Jose Ortiz, his brother, have to wait a little bit longer than he wanted to on Robert Bruce. But even when he got out, Robert Bruce was not gaining on Bricks and Mortar late. He was just kind of running along and maintaining his position. So Robert Bruce, a really nice horse, but just second best to his stablemate, as Chad Brown goes 1, 2, 3 in this race. Really just totally dominating the turf races on Saturday did Chad Brown. And I don't have a whole lot to say. Bricks and Mortar is just a really cool horse. I heard Chad say in his post-race interview that he might even consider skipping the Breeders' Cup with Bricks and Mortar because there's no race for him that really makes sense. He's not exactly a miler, and he sounds pretty convinced he doesn't want to go 1.5 miles. It's conceivable, though, that Bricks and Mortar could wrap up an Eclipse Award by winning the Arlington Million and just calling it quits because he's already achieved 3 Grade 1 wins so far this year. And if he wins the Arlington Million, I don't see how any other turf horse tops him.
Yeah, the only problem with that is it probably comes a little too early in the year. It's kind of hard to judge what else will happen and who will go on and win in the Breeders' Cup, the various races. So, I mean, while he will certainly have the credentials, that would kind of be leaving things to voters' hand. There's some other races he could run in that are probably at a decent distance, but that would be a tough call for an older turf horse. They're kind of hoping everybody else just doesn't come through trying to win an award like Horse of the Year.
Yeah, that's really true, because in addition to being champion turf male, I do think Bricks and Mortar has to put himself in the conversation for Horse of the Year, because he's the most dominant leader of any division out there right now. He's just won all of the major races in the turf division. So depending on what happens later in the year, there is a real possibility that this horse could be in the conversation for Horse of the Year, but I think he would have to race through the fall, as you're alluding to, and it sounds like that's kind of up in the air right now. So I'll be interested to see what kind of decisions Chad Brown and the connections make around that schedule. Chad Brown had one of his best fillies on display in the Just a Game, where the 4-year-old Rushing Fall just continued her winning ways. She's one neck shy of being undefeated in, I believe, 9 career starts now, and she's just so good. She just shows up every time. And now that she's developed into a front-running type, she's just really hard to beat in these races.
She is, and she's able to rate a little bit more. We actually had the first couple fractions coded in blue. So it seems like she has no problem rationing her speed. She goes just as fast as she needs to. And for a grade 1 race, this wound up looking like a paid workout. I mean, Beau Recall came from way back to get second, but was never any kind of threat whatsoever. Daddy is a legend. Looked like maybe she was going to give her a fight at the top of the stretch, but just flattened out and had nothing left. And, Rushing Fall, she could very well be the favorite for the Breeders' Cup Mile at this point. We obviously don't know what we're going to get from Europe, but from what I've heard, it's not considered one of their stronger crops. But the way she's running, there doesn't seem to be any doubt she could hang with the males as well.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what kind of decision Chad Brown makes with her as well, because I believe the Breeders' Cup Affiliate Mare Turf is 1.25 miles this year, if it's at Santa Anita. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I believe that's what the distance they run at that track. I don't know if she can get 1.25 miles. It's kind of seems like it might be a little bit far for her, but she's running speed figures that at least put her in the conversation for the mile. She'd probably have to improve a little bit, but it never hurts to have early speed in some of these races. And she's got a really versatile running style. She doesn't need the lead. She can sit right off the pace as well. And she's just got such an effective late kick. I mean, you could tell coming to the top of the stretch after going 47 and 1 to the half, there was just no chance they were going to catch her. And Beau Recall did run really well to be second. She put in her final 3/8 and something like her final half mile rather, in something like 43 and change in this race, which I know the track was very hard and fast at Belmont on Saturday, but that's a remarkable closing split for a 1 mile race. She just couldn't quite get anywhere near Rushing Fall, who had the advantage.
Right. And I just went from a speed figure perspective. She got a 123 when I originally, not Rushing Fall did. When I originally did the figures, the only 2 turf races were this and the Jaipur, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. And it actually had her getting a higher figure around a 127 when I combined those 2 races. But it just made the Jaipur much too low. I just couldn't believe that was true. So I wound up rating the races separately. It's 2 different. It's the same course, but 2 different setups. So I split them up a little bit. So her figure could even be higher, is my point. It's certainly probably at the lowest I could have gone, and it wouldn't shock me if she could run in the 125, even a 128 figure. I think she has that kind of ability.
Yeah, when she gets that kind of setup, I think that she might be able to do it. And let's talk about the Jaipur, which is up next on the list. Another race that was basically over right after the start, because once you saw that first quarter go up in almost 22 seconds, which might sound fast, but over the hard turf course that we had on Saturday at Belmont Park, 22 flat in a 6 furlong race for grade 1 horses. It's just basically walking on the lead for a horse like World of Trouble, and they were just not going to catch him. He sprinted for home in the lane. Ohm was trying, Disco Partner was trying his heart out to come with that late run, but World of Trouble is just in great form right now, and he's almost impossible to beat with a setup like this.
He is. Like you said, it was over. The only horse I really thought that might be able to beat him in here was Belvoir Bay, and I don't know if it was Dubai, but she didn't have quite her speed that she'd shown in California and when she shipped overseas. So, I mean, Ohm's a decent enough horse. He was narrowly beaten in the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint a couple years ago. He was turning back in distance. I think at this point, It's time to say Disco Partners maybe lost a step. He's still a solid enough horse. I'm sure he can win some stakes races. But even with this setup, he doesn't quite have that same kick that he used to have. So World of Trouble, he's just an exciting horse. I would assume at this point they're going to try to keep him on turf. I should say point to the Breeders' Cup on turf. But there's more money to be made on dirt. So I imagine they're going to take advantage of going back and forth. And I'm curious what you think. I can't think of a horse who could run as well on dirt and turf sprinting in a very long time as World of Trouble does.
No, not a sprinter. We've seen some routers do it years ago, especially when synthetic tracks were more popular. We saw horses going back and forth between or among the three surfaces, but just back and forth between dirt and turf for the sprinter, I can't think of one. And there's more incentive to do it these days because the turf sprints they've gained a little bit of prestige in recent years. We didn't have these grade 2 and grade 1 turf sprints going back 5 or 6 years. And now we've got races like the grade 1 Jaipur. So there's a little bit of incentive to diversify a little bit and to run in turf sprints as well as dirt sprints if you have a horse that can handle both of them. And World of Trouble, he's on a path to potentially be the champion sprinter if he chooses the races correctly and is able to win a couple more grade 1s. He's already got 2 under his belt, this one and the Carter. Maybe they're not the toughest spots, but I think his owner, Michael Dubb, and trainer Jason Service are really picking the right kind of path to get him a championship in this division. And I think when the end of the year comes around, it's going to be interesting to see what decision they make with regard to the Breeders' Cup Sprint at 6 furlongs, as opposed to the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint, which is down the hill at 6.5. Both are interesting options, and he seems like a horse that's versatile enough to do either one.
And the interesting thing there is currently, I think the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint is slated to be run at 5 furlongs because they basically eliminated 6.5 furlongs. I've actually looked on the Breeders' Cup site and it's showing 5 furlongs. So I assume for now that's the plan. And, that could actually be a little tougher for him. I think 6.5 would be easier. He'd have to show obviously a lot more high early speed at 5 furlongs than he would going down the hill. So some interesting decisions to be made. I keep hearing about Roy H. He's got to beat Roy H. But I'm the kind, until you actually show up and start running again, I'm going to go with what's on the track and what I can see with my eyes.
I agree with that. The final stakes race on Saturday at Belmont Park was the Brooklyn, which was run very late in the day. I'd actually already made it home by the time this race was run, and I left right after the Belmont Stakes. Watching this race on video, it was a really unique situation where the sun was setting. It reminds me of, I don't know if you ever played the 2004 version of Gallop Racer, where you can participate in the Dream Cup at the end of the year, and they take you to this track, Sunset Beach, and it's this really picturesque setting where the horses are running down the stretch as the sun is setting, and the sun is just reflecting off the track and the jockeys, and it really reminded me of the dramatic lighting that you have for that kind of in that video game. Watching this Brooklyn, it was a fun race to watch in the sense that it was exciting. You had a bunch of horses coming to the wire together, actually 6 horses within a length of each other at the finish of this race. Not the fastest edition of the Brooklyn, though.
No, it wound up slower than the Belmont, I think largely because of the pace. I think these horses are probably capable of running as fast as Sir Winston did. But I actually commented on the pace on Twitter, and Charles Simon, a trainer down in Florida, said they had to be careful because they were running in the dark, which I thought was pretty funny. But, the finish doesn't lie. It was a tightly bunched group. I think the top 5 were all within a length. And that's what happens when they only really raced for about the last half mile. Marconi was able to take advantage of being on the good part of the track and not having to do much work early and hold off horses like Rocketry and Realm and Campaign. Going back and watching the replay, because I didn't watch this race live. I was pretty burnt out by the time. I think Campaign is one who probably had the toughest trip in here. He ran into some trouble, just had nowhere to go, and given the pace, he's one I would excuse. But as far as from a figure standpoint, I wouldn't put a whole lot of stock in these just because of the pace.
Yeah, basically every horse in this race got the same speed figure, and I think that just kind of sums up how they ran. Marconi, I guess, was helped by being on the rail, although I'm not sure how strong of an advantage the rail really was at this point in the day. The track bias was totally gone by Sunday at Belmont Park. And it felt like the track might have been evening out at the end of the day on Saturday, because it didn't seem like horses that were off the rail in this Brooklyn were really badly compromised. You even had Realm, who was 2 to 3 wide throughout his trip at 20-1, barely losing this race by 3/4 of a length. So I'm just not sure how much the rail really affected the outcome of this Brooklyn. Marconi's a nice horse, but he was really aided by how slow the pace was. I agree with you about Campaign, just wasn't the right setup for him. I would also say Rocketry had to go a little bit wide and was just behind the 8 ball for the entire race, coming from so far back. That's just his style. There's no way around that. He ran really well to be second, considering the pace dynamics, but just a race that I don't know how many conclusions you can really draw from it, because it was such an odd situation with the pace being so slow. We'll move on to some of the races from Friday and Thursday, as well as one stakes from Sunday at Belmont Park. And we'll try to go through them a little quickly, because we took a lot of time up with the Saturday undercard races. The True North was one of the feature races on Friday of the Belmont Festival. And Catalina Cruiser came east from California, making his first start of 2019. And he got the job done. It was a gritty win. He had to work really hard for it, but nice to see him get back in the winner's circle.
He did, and this was a day I mentioned earlier. We have Coded in Red as favoring speed. Definitely think it was part of the rail, and he kind of overcame that. I was a little disappointed in his speed figure. He only got a 116, where he had run in the 130s before at Del Mar. I think he hit a 130 when he won the I forget what the stakes race was out there. But, solid effort. I don't want to be too hard on him. It's his first race since the Breeders' Cup Mile, where he disappointed as a favorite. I actually bet Strike Power in here, who held on till the very last strides, but I don't think he had any real excuse. He said a solid but not overly taxing pace was on the best part of the track and just couldn't get the job done. No doubt to my mind, Catalina Cruiser was best. I just would have liked to seen a little better speed figure, but I'm going to cut him some slack given a layoff.
Just curious, did you consider breaking this race out or making the argument that the track slowed throughout the day? Because I know there were some races early in the day on Friday, I think a couple of which we'll discuss, that earned very fast times, including a maiden race and a New York bred allowance race that almost got the same figure as this True North. Did you consider that, or you just think it was kind of a unique pace situation where these horses weren't able to achieve a faster final time?
I will be honest, I don't remember that off the top of my head, but I will, when we tweet out a link to this podcast, I'll be sure to comment underneath it and let us know.
Yeah, no, I'm not advocating for doing so. I just thought it was.
No, I understand. I just don't remember.
Yeah. Catalina Cruiser, he's got to move forward off this race to really be a player in the sprint division, or I assume they'll try to stretch him out again to maybe a mile and a 16th in the summer at Del Mar. But just a good starting place for a horse like him, I think, to get the win in this race. Moving on to another race on Friday, going a sprint distance on the dirt, we saw the fillies in action in the Bed of Roses. Another race that was really decided at the start, because there was not a lot of speed in this race, and Jose Ortiz showed aggression from the outside post under riding Separation of Powers, and he just got her to the front, and nobody really challenged him. The pace wasn't slow. It's not like they were walking, but they were going fractions that are certainly within the powers of certainly within the comfort zone of Separation of Powers, and she just drew off late, got back to her best form in this spot.
She did. It was solid effort. She was clear early. She fought off a challenge from, I think it was Spring in the Wind, kind of moved up on the turn on her, but she was able to easily repel her and just, ran by herself through the stretch. Challen got up to be a good second. That one was a little puzzling to me, how she was even money in this field. I thought they went overboard, but didn't really help me here because I didn't come up with the winner. But a good effort from Separation of Powers. I think she could probably run a little further if she needs to. And, 120 is a good speed figure for fillies and mares. So she's certainly a graded stakes filly.
Yeah, the money that Chalon took was a little surprising, and the ride that she got was also surprising because I believe that she was the leader on our pace projector, Chalon, clearly in front. And for whatever reason, Javier Castellano seemed intent on taking her off the pace, actually to the back of the pack early. I'm not sure what the strategy was there because that certainly didn't help her at all. She had to overcome an unfavorable situation. I still think she was only going to finish second in this race because Separation of Powers really ran. But just an odd set of tactics for Chalon. Dawn the Destroyer was out in basically the parking lot for her entire trip. She was about 6 wide for her entire race, and she was able to get up for third. So again, I don't think the rail bias was especially strong on Friday even, though it was present, because a horse like Dawn the Destroyer, who was a bit of a long shot in this race, was extremely wide and was able to get up for third. So just to kind of comment on how strong the rail bias was there. Moving on to some turf races, the Belmont Gold Cup, I'm sure neither of us have a ton to say about this race. The winner, Ahmad, a horse coming in from France, just can run all day, and he just outstayed his American foes, although Arklow did run pretty well to be second.
Yeah, they ran well. I mentioned that, I make figures for these, but they're not really speed figures. They're more like race ratings. The top two got 122s, which puts it at a grade 3, which I think is what it's rated. I don't remember off the top of my head, but Arklow's kind of a fan favorite out there, so good to see him run well. And, that's about all I got to say about it. Highland Sky is a horse I bet at a huge price in here, but I knew he didn't have much chance given the pace, which was really slow in here. But, the horse who won the race was right back there with him and just worked out a better trip and outfinished him. So no complaints there. And, that's about it for me for a 2-mile race.
Going back 3 years, I remember I was making the case to somebody that I thought that Highland Sky could be the turf champion as a 3-year-old. Well, here we are 3 years later, and he picked up his first graded stakes placing since then. So that's how that opinion worked out. But yeah, I don't have a whole lot to say about this race. I hope they cut Arklow back in distance, and I imagine they will, because he's just in great form right now. And I think a race like the Sword Dancer at Saratoga would be perfect for him. And I imagine they'll do that because he's just he really seems to be fired in these races now as a 5-year-old.
Yeah, you almost have to cut back. There's no go.
Yeah, there's
going forward from further. This one.
One race earlier on Friday in New York, we saw another display of the firepower in Chad Brown's stable as he finished 1-2 with his heavy favorite Homerique and his second stringer Competition of Ideas. Once again, Homerique got the better of Competition of Ideas, although I do want to make the point for a second straight race, Competition of Ideas had the tougher trip. Irad Ortiz gave Homerique a perfect ride. He got her to the inside path around the far turn, saved all the ground, got out with enough time in the stretch, and just got that perfect split through on the inside and had the turn of foot to get there, whereas Competition of Ideas was coming from farther back in the pack in a slow-paced situation, had to go wide around the field. I'm not saying she would have won because maybe Homerique is just a better horse and maybe she had more in reserve, but it's just funny that twice in a row, the horse that's the heavy favorite got the perfect trip and the horse from the same stable who's slightly lesser regarded had the tougher trip and almost got there. These two are very close in terms of ability.
They are, and they both got 123 TimeformUS speed figures for the effort. This is a tricky kind of race where you have a slow pace, but the pace setters really didn't do much. They didn't stick around at the end. Semper, I forget what her name is, Senti, I'm not even going to try.
It's good enough for me.
Yeah, ran third with a 116, but she was pretty much third all the way around. So I think when the pace collapses like this, you have horses that set a slow pace and even then can't stick around. It kind of holds the figure back a little bit. So I think both these horses are probably capable of more than the 123 that they ran. They're clearly the two best horses in the race, despite only finishing, a neck apart. They were 3.5 in front of the rest. So which is just a huge gap on turf. So both of these look like grade one fillies to me, and I expect to see more out of them this summer.
Yeah, I would imagine Competition of Ideas will be looking to duck Homerique at some point in the future. I guess one of them will go to the Beverly D, and I would assume another one will go to the Diana. Maybe they'll go to the same race. Who knows? Because Chad Brown has so many fillies, he's got to split them up somehow. Yeah, these two they're both nice horses, and I think Homerique is establishing herself as maybe one of the best in Chad Brown's stable, but I don't think she's got a huge edge on her stablemate. Moving on to continue with the Chad Brown show and talking about his embarrassment of riches, we also saw him finish 1-2 in the Wonder again on Thursday as Cambier Park, his lesser-regarded filly, ran down Newspaper of Record, who won the Breeders' Cup last year and is regarded by many to be the best 3-year-old turf horse in the country. Not a good loss for Newspaper of Record. Starting to get concerned about just the fact that she hasn't taken a step forward since last year and these antics where she just refuses to settle in her races. It got her beat once again.
It did, and it's kind of odd. And the pace was pretty slow, but she clearly resented it. She didn't like it a whole lot. As a bettor, she's a horse I'm going to keep betting against. I did pretty well in this race, taking that stand. And until she proves me wrong, she's just going to keep getting bet on reputation, just because she's not running terribly. I mean, she's finishing second in graded stakes races, and people are going to keep hoping that she gets back to that 2-year-old form. But until she shows me, I'm going to be against, because taking steps back off your figures, especially she had a pretty long layoff. It's not like she took a 2-month layoff. She had a pretty good break. She should have come back running faster, and we're just not seeing it. So until she gets her head on straight and puts a whole race together, I'm going to keep taking her on at the windows.
Yeah, I don't know what to say about her. I wonder if they'll press on to a race like the Belmont Oaks going 1.25 miles. At this point, I don't see how she's getting 1.25 miles when she just refuses to settle in the early going of her races. I mean, they were going in slow fractions, but she was just throwing her head about. Irad Ortiz never was able to put his hands on her neck. He was just back in the saddle, trying to balance her to get her to settle. It just didn't happen. And it really detracts from her late kick in these races. Whereas as a 2-year-old, she was running over more demanding turf courses, and she just ran those fields off their feet. They couldn't really make up late ground on her because she had sapped their energy in the beginning of those races. But we've got horses now like Cambier Park who have really honed their late kicks and can come with those sprint finishes, and she just can't withstand a horse like that, as we saw with Concrete Rose in the prior race. So I wonder what the right thing to do with her is. Do they turn her back in distance? I don't know. It's a tough situation, but I do want to mention Cambier Park and give her some credit because she's in great form right now. Her 118 TimeformUS speed figure, that makes her one of the top contenders in the Belmont Oaks next month. So Chad Brown's got a good one with her. She's really developed. But newspaper of record, a frustrating horse, I would assume, because I'm not sure what they're going to do with her. Maybe we'll see her in a race like the Intercontinental next year, because that certainly worked for a significant form who didn't want to go those longer distances as a 3-year-old. And they turned her back in distance to the 7 furlongs of the Intercontinental. And it really seemed to work out well for her.
Yeah, and she was able to overcome what we have coded as a pretty slow pace, especially after the opening quarter was solid, and then it really slowed down to the half, and she just bided her time and waited and was able to explode anyway. She did save quite a bit of ground, but I think she was clearly the best horse in here. This is a case where, and David can vouch for this, where actually I'm doing a little research on these because I probably should be giving her a little more credit for overcoming that slow pace than I do. She actually got a 113 TimeformUS speed figure when she had a 117 final time number. And I think that 117 is probably more representative of her ability.
Yeah, these are tough races to assess because Belmont's kind of a unique configuration. We see the same thing at Woodbine, where these 7 furlong races play more like 1 mile races. And significant form was, I think, legitimately compromised by the pace in this race, as was her stablemate Stella de Camelot, who actually ran really well to be third, coming from farther back in the pack. But if you want to watch a daring ride, watch Irad Ortiz on significant form in this race, because he was loaded behind the leaders at the top of the stretch, and he was so patient, just waiting for that hole to open up, and he knew he had the horse to get through it when it did. And luckily, at about the 8th pole, he got that split and was able to send her through there. She was best, no question about it. Just interested to see what Chad Brown does with her, because it does seem like 1 mile and 1/8 is pushing it for her. That's a little bit too far. It seems like maybe 1 mile and 1/16 as her maximum distance. This 7 furlongs was fine for her. But there are a bunch of different races he'll consider, I would assume. Maybe a race like the First Lady in the fall at Keeneland will be good for her going the flat mile. But she's a nice horse. Yet another good filly in Chad Brown's stable.
Yeah, just a quick mention. You see, Irad Ortiz, he takes a lot of grief on social media, but I really think the guy, I mean, he's obviously a top rider. You don't have to be a rocket scientist and know that, but I think he's really getting better and better as time goes on. And you know, he may even be the best rider out there, in my opinion. I'm not a huge fan. I love speed horses, and I don't think speed horses are his strength. But if you're looking for a patient and a strong ride, he's your guy.
Yeah, in terms of just personally, I don't often talk about praising riders and who are my favorite riders, but just in terms of finesse and patience and riding the turf and getting through at the right time, Irad Ortiz and Joel Rosario, when he's really on and riding well, they're two of the best in my opinion, just in terms of finding the right trips for closers in these races. Moving on to a couple of 2-year-old races, one on Thursday and one on Friday at Belmont Park. We'll start with the Colts. On Friday, we saw 4 Left take the Tremont. A visually impressive race that just didn't stack up as one of the faster races against the clock.
No, and it looked like a weak race coming in, to be honest. 4 Left was coming in. I think he ran like a week and a half ago. He broke his maiden out in California, and he had no trouble shipping east and beating the horses that were in against him. Not a strong race, only an 85 TimeformUS speed figure. And I haven't mentioned it for those more familiar with buyers. We're generally about 20 points higher. Of course, from race to race, that can vary, but I don't think an 85 on our numbers or 65 on buyers is going to blow anybody away. And I would expect that as we get to Saratoga, we're going to see a lot better 2-year-olds. And these guys are either going to have to step it up or fall by the wayside.
No, I thought it was great race placement by Doug O'Neill to ship this horse out east and take advantage of a pretty weak spot. But I agree. I think there'll be better horses as we get further into the summer. I think the Astoria is actually a more interesting race because it was faster. And we saw a first-time starter win for Jeremiah Engelhart, Marianne or Ginger, making her debut in this race. Had to overcome a stumbling start, showed a ton of professionalism for a horse making its debut. And I was impressed by this one.
Yeah, I was as well. And for the record, you're probably too young. I'm 100% in the Marianne camp. But
yeah, this is a Gilligan's Island thing, right?
Yes. Absolutely. But yeah, and this was one of those cases where they knew. I mean, this horse took plenty of money as a first-time starter, stepping in the stakes company. Odd to see one of these races won by a first-time starter from well back as she did. She got a decent TimeformUS speed figure in 96. And as opposed to the Colts, this is one I look forward to seeing at Saratoga because she clearly showed some promise. She showed she doesn't need the lead, and probably extra distance will only help her.
I agree with that. And I would say the same thing about the runner-up, Perfect Alibi, who I just want to give a brief shout out to because she was so impressive in her debut at Churchill Downs a few weeks ago. And she was coming back on pretty short rest to run in this race. She was a little wide throughout. She was finishing up after being hard-ridden on the turn. She's the kind of horse that's really actually bred to be a router. She's actually a half-sister to Noble Thought, who competed in the 2-mile Belmont Gold Cup. Just funny to see these half-siblings running in the shortest and longest races of the weekend. And she's one that I would assume will get better as the distances get longer throughout the summer at Saratoga and even getting into the fall where they go route distances. So I think both of these fillies are actually okay, and we might see them in some stakes later in the year. The final stakes race that we'll talk about from the past weekend at Belmont took place on Sunday, where Brad Cox's undefeated filly, Break Even, got her, I believe, 5th consecutive victory in the Jersey Girl. Had to work harder for it than I think some people anticipated, but she actually ran her race. I think it was the runner-up that really improved to give her a scare.
Yeah, when I saw the margin, I was a little worried. I was like, wow, she didn't come close to matching that 120 she ran. I believe it was on Oaks Day at Churchill. And, when I sat down to do the figures, it was a really easy figure-making day. And she wound up getting a 114. She didn't break very clean, and the pace was pretty slow in here. But still a solid effort from her. But I'm with you. Sue's Fortune really stepped it up and made her work for this. Those two were well clear of the rest. And, solid efforts. There's some decent filly sprinters out this year, and it could make for an interesting division.
And Sue's Fortune, kind of like Marianne or Ginger, is another horse trained by Jeremiah Engelhart. She's actually a New York bred, and she had won the Adirondack last summer at Saratoga. She had one race back, and she beat a New York bred field a month ago, but it seems like she's really taken a step forward since then. And if she runs another race like this, she's competitive in graded stakes moving forward. So I agree with you. I think both of these fillies are very nice and competitors in some of the bigger races later this summer. Before we wrap up the podcast, we'll just talk about 2 non-stakes races from last weekend at Belmont Park. One of those was a race that earned a comparable speed figure to the True North on Friday at Belmont. It was the first race of the day at Maiden Field. that just looked loaded with talent on paper. And unsurprisingly, one of the first-time starters, Double Orb, stepped forward. Although the nature of his victory and how the distance that he won by and the fact that he beat the well-regarded Ahead of Plan by about 4 or 5 lengths, I think that was surprising to some. And the 114 Timeform US Speed figure is quite a number for a debut.
Yeah, it was a big figure for sure. And it just said Ahead of Plan. He was well bet in his debut. He was bet down to 3 to 5 here, and he was just no match for Double Orb. Now, I haven't watched the trip to see how much ground the Ahead of Plan saved. I'm not sure if he was on the rail or not. I'm sure you know better than me. But in any case, he still ran a 107, which is a significant improvement over his debut. So he ran his race. He just got beat by a horse who was loaded for bear for Steve Asmussen.
Yeah, Double Orb did ride the rail for his entire trip, whereas some others were outside. So I think that might have exaggerated the margin of victory a little bit, but no question about it. This is a good horse. And some horses behind him actually also ran well. Per Capita, another firster for Chad Brown, ran well to be third. And even Christophe Clement's horse, Just for One Day, who battled on the lead with Double Orb and faded. He's one to look forward to down the line as well, maybe even getting on the turf. So I think there was a lot of talent in this maiden race, and it's one that we'll see some horses coming out of in the future. And one allowance race that we'll mention from Thursday was won by Rowayton, a 3-year-old who earned another respectable speed figure coming through on the rail. What'd you think of this race? This horse put in a really fast final 16th of a mile, coming home his last 16th in, I believe, something like 5 4/5 seconds.
Yeah, this was a race I was watching. I actually bet Rowayton. I don't even remember who the favorite. I think it was Payne was the favorite, who I wasn't overly enamored with in here. And I just thought Rowayton was a more talented horse. And watching the race, I was a little worried he was never going to get out. It was pretty clear to my eye that once he got out, he was going to win, if he could get through. And he did. And he finished really strong. I mean, he only had like a 105 or 106 pace figure after a half mile. And he finished up with a final time figure of 121. So, I think he showed he's back. He's a horse who has developed from his 2-year-old season. And I look forward to big things from him. He had a promising 2-year-old year, and he showed he's back.
Yeah, Rowayton seems like the kind of horse that could target the Alan Jerkins this summer, because he earned a respectable 116 Timeform US Speed figure for this race. And I really liked the professionalism he showed, waiting and coming through on the inside with that burst of speed at the 8th pole. That's the kind of thing you want to see for a horse that had previously been very headstrong and very speed crazy as a 2-year-old. Seems like he's mellowed a bit as a 3-year-old, and just the kind of improvements you want to see a horse making. Payne also ran really well. He's not a 3-year-old. He's an older horse. He's I believe, a 5-year-old now. But he made a sweeping move around the far turn to get to the lead. Probably had the tougher trip because he was wide, and I think you did want to be on the rail even this day. But Rowayton, you don't often see horses running as fast as he did over the final 16th to run down a horse who had made that decisive move like Payne did. So both of these are really nice horses, and Rowayton might have even more improvement in him as we get to races later in the summer. And speaking of races down the line, let's just wrap up the show. Are there any races in particular for this summer or fall that you're really looking forward to after seeing the results of this weekend?
Not so much races. I'm not going to lie. I'm not one that follows where I think horses are going to show up, but I want to see horses like Kofefi. I would obviously want to see Guarana. I'd be interested in seeing where Maximum Security shows up again, though I'm a little skeptical given the setbacks he's apparently having, what we're going to see from him. But I'm really looking forward mostly to how this 3-year-old crop plays out and to see who's going to step forward and if anybody can really take a stranglehold on the top of the division, or if we're just going to see kind of chaos the rest of the year as we have so far most of this year. I think the older horses stepped up. I always, for some reason, want to call Mackenzie Justify, and I almost did it again. But I think Mackenzie is probably going to go back to running longer. I don't think he's a horse that he's going to want to sprint. But with that 130 that he ran, he's certainly one who's going to be tough for any of the 3-year-olds to deal with. They'll certainly have to develop over what we've seen so far. And probably my favorite horse, who I haven't mentioned, is Matoli. Whatever they do with him, I'm always going to be there to watch. I think it's a certainty we'll never get 7-2 on him again. So that was a good thing on Saturday. But he's the horse I most want to follow through the season.
Yeah, I'm just looking forward to all the horses we're going to see run at Saratoga this summer, especially the Travers. I love a good handicapping puzzle, and it seems like this 3-year-old division is really going to make for a fun handicapping race in the Travers. I'm sure there'll be some fun comparisons to make among all these horses. So that's a race I'm looking forward to. I'm holding out some hope that Bob Baffert decides to ship McKenzie to one of the races at Saratoga this summer, because I don't think 1.25 miles is his best distance. And I know that's the distance they run the Pacific Classic at. I think the 1.1 miles of the Whitney or Woodward would be much better for him. So we'll see what Bob Baffert does with him. But he's obviously a horse in great form. And of course, I agree with you about Mitole. I assume we'll see him in the Forgo down the line. But he's going to be tough to beat wherever he shows up, because he's arguably the best horse in the country right now off his Met Mile victory. So just a really fun weekend of racing. Great to talk about it with you, Craig. And we are the TimeformUS Pacecast. Just a reminder, you can always catch us on drf.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or SoundCloud. Just subscribe to the Daily Racing Form on any of those streaming services. So thanks again for talking about these races, Craig, and looking forward to catching up with you again next week. Thanks, guys.